All right. If you got a Bible and you want to follow along, please turn in it to Luke chapter 11. This is where we'll be spending our time today. You know, one of the things about that hymn that we just sang that really, really strikes me is just the fact that we're all sitting here today because we've said yes to Jesus. We just prayed for a family that's having a funeral this week, right? But because we've said yes to Jesus, the prospect of that is no longer to be feared. I don't even know how you measure that. The fact that at my age, your age, wherever we are in life, that we can walk through this world having the thing that we know we have to face. We have to eliminate it as a place of fear. That's a big deal. That's a big deal. Missionary groups have taken the gospel into places where they don't even know the language. And the way they do this is, the way they've been doing it for the last 30 years, there's one of the many films that it's called the Jesus film. I've seen it, you've probably seen it and don't realize you've seen it. It's just a movie about the life of Jesus. And they take the film into these places where none of the missionaries know how to speak the language of the people there. They may not even have a written one. Most of them don't. And they put a screen up, they crank a generator, and they run a projector, and they show the Jesus film with no sound, because what would be the point? They can't understand a word of anything that's being said. It's all in English. And people become born again just because they watch the film. People are converted by the power of Jesus' life. That's enough. So how do we hear the gospel of Jesus today? Let's think about that as we look at this text. I'll begin reading in verse 33 of chapter 11, if you want to follow along. No one lights a lamp and puts it in a place where it's going to be hidden or under a bowl. Instead, they put the lamp on a stand so that anybody who comes into the house will see the light. Your eye, Jesus says, is the lamp of your body. When your eyes are good, your whole body's filled with light. But when your eyes are bad, your body is in darkness. See to it then that the light in you is not darkness. Therefore, if your whole body is full of light, and no part of it dark, it will be completely lit, as when the light of a lamp in a home shines on you. Now this text, it's kind of one of those obvious ones that anybody could understand. He makes the contrast. For the Hebrews, light was the big deal. For the Romans, it was glory. For the Hebrews, it was light. If you read the Old Testament texts regarding what God brings, He brings light. And for them, that was the big feature of what it is to walk in this world knowing, as they would say, knowing Yahweh, knowing the God, the maker of the universe. But we're in a text here that's actually, this is a part of the Sermon on the Mount. I don't know if you're aware of that, but it is. And Luke puts it in here. Now, Luke's gospel differs from Matthew's gospel. When people talk about the Sermon on the Mount, they typically think of Matthew chapter 5 and following. And that's good. Luke plugs it in. He plugs pieces of the Sermon on the Mount throughout his gospel. And people look at that and they say, look at these guys. They can't even get the story straight. They scramble it all up. Nobody's saying the same thing. That shouldn't surprise us at all. There are 4 gospel writers. They're all different people. You take 4 of us out there and stand us next to the intersection up there in Manor, and a tractor trailer slams into a Yugo. Every one of us is going to report that accident differently. So we shouldn't find it surprising that the Gospels differ in this way. It's 4 different people. As a matter of fact, if I found the Gospels all totally agreeing, word for word, I'd say these Jewish boys got together and cooked something up. So the fact that they differ is a good thing, not a bad thing. Jesus is making a statement here about His preaching. Now, I could never make this statement. Jesus said stuff about Himself that really be uncomfortable if I were to say that. He's saying that His preaching is actually bringing light. That's pretty amazing. You just stand in front of a group of people and say, my preaching brings light? No wonder people, when they saw Jesus or heard Him preach, they were astonished because He spoke, as the Scriptures say, not as the scribes and the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. They were just reciting what they had. Jesus spoke it out as though it was his. That's very different, very different. And so it's kind of an audacious thing for him to say, but we're reading it today and we say, well, what does it mean for us? The light, the eye is the lamp of the whole body. What does it mean for us to have darkness as light or light within us? I remember, and part of our problem here is, this is one of those little texts that we're kind of used to. That's part of the problem when we look at the gospel. We're used to it. And we're so familiar with these little things that Jesus taught that they don't punch us anymore like they punch these people. I remember when Jackson, our son, was little. Now, if you've been around a small child for any length of time at all, what do you have to have in the cabinet for small children during the day? You've got to have little, nowadays, videos. You got to have little movies that they can watch. And Jackson would pull these movies out. I mean, we just watched that 2 hours ago. But he wants to see it again. He wants to see Littlefoot 30 times a week. Or Animal Babies 30 times a week and just watch. I mean, I got to where Becky and I had jokes between us where we would recite the lines of these movies because we'd seen them so many times. Like there's one of them where the snake comes and drinks water out of this bowl, and the snake is a real snake, and it's supposed to be talking. So they put voices with all these animal babies, and the snake says, "Ooh, that's good." And Becky and I made that joke for years when we'd have something to drink because we were so used to seeing that. But for Jackson, he would watch that movie 100 times in a week, and it was exciting to him every time he saw it. That's what God is like. God is like that. He is always, do you think about this, what's going to happen when we're in heaven? Is it going to be like everybody sitting around plucking, like in the images you see in cartoons, everybody plucking these little lyres? Like, I don't know if you ever watched Star Trek. Spock had one of those, you know. He had this little instrument that he'd sit there and pluck, and everybody was just enthralled with him. Do you think that's what we're going to do? Or we're just going to float around and look around? No, we're going to be in front of God. And he's going to be new, not just every day, but every minute. We are never going to be bored. I remember hearing someone talk about heaven. They said, what would be heaven for you? And this great philosopher, professor at Boston College said, I'm looking forward to it because I know I'm never going to be bored again, ever. That's what God is like. And we forget that. We read these Gospels and they just lose that edge for us because we've heard it so many times. God can help us recapture that to some degree. You know, children can do the same thing 100 times and they don't ever grow bored with it. It's amazing, isn't it? I remember a friend of mine who went as a part-time missionary to Mexico. And she said these children are so poor. I mean, they just don't have anything. But she would pick one of them up and play with the child and toss them in the air. And what the child would say after about 4 tosses, you know, your arms are burning. I mean, you can't throw a 40-pound kid up in the air but so many times and catch him. And the kid would say, otra vez, again. Another time, do it again. That's what it's going to be like with God. We're never going to be bored with it. But then there's us, right? Here we are in this gathering today. We do this every week. And so for us, this every weakness becomes part of the sameness, which becomes part of the drowsiness, which becomes part of the boredom with it all. Why is that? What are we coming here for? I mean, it could be all my fault. It could be. Now, I'm willing to say that. You know, I'm not on a beach ball juggling flaming bowling pins while I preach, and then next week, of course, I'd have to juggle chainsaws while I'm doing the same thing, and then each week it would just have to get more and more ramped up so that everybody would go, well, look at that. That's not the way it works when we walk with God. God is the novelty. And if we find ourselves distant from Him because we're bored with it all, that should drive us to start asking God to change our hearts. That's something we cannot do for ourselves. We can think about it really hard, and we can try and grit our teeth and close our eyes and squint down and try to whoop God up in some way so that we won't be feeling that way. But that's not how it works. These things that happen to us, these elements of who we are that tend to squash us in some way, like boredom, they are there on purpose because they can remind us that we can turn to God and He can change that. He can change that. I mean, do we come here just to receive? That's partially why we come, right? But there's another part. There's a part where we come here to gather to be used, where God's going to take you or me or somebody and a pat on the back, a conversation, something wherein we're doing something by interacting, and God is using that to change a life. I mean, how many times have you read stories of somebody who has come into a congregational setting totally depressed, to the point of being nearly suicidal, and somebody in that congregation just walked up to them and put their hand on their shoulder and said, "I'm so glad to see you today. I'm so glad you're here." And their life changed because of that. They decided, you know what, it's worth living. I don't want to kill myself. I'm telling you, we don't realize that every minute of every day, God has got stuff for us to do. Becky and I went to a funeral this week. Let me just give you a picture of my world. And if you knew how far off the notes I am right now, you'd think, good grief, where's he going? We went to a funeral this week, and it was our brother-in-law's mom. She was very aged. She'd been down for a long time in a nursing home. And there's a lot of history there that I don't want to go into, but I remember when Becky said to me in the house, "I guess you don't want to go to the funeral this week." And I got to tell you, my first response was, dang right I don't want to go. I don't want to have to put everything I'm doing down and take 2 days out of schoolwork, getting ready for this sermon on Sunday, everything else that I have to prepare for week by week, and my job, where I'm just going to be 2 days not there, and go to this funeral for somebody I've never even met. I have never met his mother. But I'll tell you something, God pricked my heart, and we went. And I have never in my, this is a man who is hard. And he came up to me and put his head on my shoulder. He was so overcome that we had made that trip. Oh. I just thought, man, I would have missed that had I not gone. God used us in a moment. All we did was drive, fight Atlanta traffic, sleep in a hotel, go to a funeral. All the stuff was just normal. None of it had any great meaning, but it meant something to him. And you and I get chances to do that all the time. I think about it in terms of our home life and our spouses, people in the home whom we care about. God gives us chances to do something that really, really means something. Is the light in us darkness, or is it light? He gives us a chance, lots of them, to be salt and light to the people that are around us. Do we take those chances? He says, see to it that the light in you is not darkness, Jesus says. I'm back on the notes now. Well, we're glad of that. We've been 10 weeks, well, not 10 weeks, more than that, looking at 10 different ways in which a person can be spiritually paralyzed in Sunday school. Lots of different good conversations. Each one of them is focused on some kind of area of living as a believer that has to do with being disciplined in some way. And when we hear that word, we think about study or something that's hard. No. The discipline of walking with God is that in the stupid stuff we're doing all day, every day, is God present in those moments or not? Are we doing what we do in each moment of living as to say, join me in this day, Lord. I want to spend it with you. That's easy to do. And I'll tell you something, God will rush into that for you. It's not pie in the sky. He will. But Jesus is saying something very significant here, and this speaks to me A heart, what does he mean when he says, don't let the light that's in you become darkness? That's weird, isn't it? It means something very simple. If you read your scripture and you find places where Paul will say something like, a person's heart can be seared as with a branding iron. What does that mean? That a person's heart can become so hardened to God that they don't hear him anymore at all. I remember, I don't know how many of you are familiar, I know one person in here is, are familiar with the history of World War II. During the Nuremberg trials, when they brought the Nazis up on trial for war crimes, there was one of the Nazis, I don't remember which one, they were asking about all the atrocious things the Nazis had done to the Jews, the Gypsies, the Romas, the homosexuals, the mentally deficient, everybody in their culture that they thought needed to be eliminated to make room for the master race. And this guy said, the worst thing was not what we did to all of them. The worst thing is what we did to ourselves. During the Nazi period, when they moved into Eastern Europe, the Nazis, they didn't have enough people to get rid of the Jews. They didn't have enough guns and bullets and people to find the Jews. So what they did, the one city that strikes me in this history was Lithuania. They came into Lithuania, they recruited the locals, the local men who weren't Jews, to go into the community because they knew who the Jews were. See, the Nazis would have to hunt them. Are you a Jew? They said, we don't want to bother, it's too much work. So we'll recruit the Lithuanians to go in. They know who they are. They can pull them out and they can take, and what they were doing was they deputized them. They issued them rifles. They taught them what to do, told them how to handle this, and they recruited them so that instead of 100 Germans, there'd be one commanding the Lithuanian militia to go and hunt the Jews. So they taught them how to dig the holes, get the Jews to dig their own hole, and then stand on the next to the hole, and then they would shoot them. Just men, women, and children right there. Just shoot them, let them fall in the hole, and cover them up and go find some more. They didn't count on the fact that people's hearts are only so calloused. The Lithuanians came to the place where they were just, that they would send some of them away on a vacation for a year. Some of the Nazis, just the seeing this happening day in and day out, their hearts were not calloused enough that they could do this day in and day out and it not affect them. That's what that Nazi meant when he said the worst thing is what we did to ourselves. We calloused our hearts so much that we could do this and it didn't hurt us. Think about that. Jesus is saying the same thing to you and me. He's saying our hearts, you, me, our hearts can become so callous toward God that he no longer can touch our hearts. And it has a lot to do. Be encouraged. It has a lot to do with us saying, I'm going to gather on Sunday. It does. I mean, it seems so simple and so straightforward, doesn't it? It's like, what's the big deal? It is a big deal. Because for some, this is it. When it comes to walking with God through the week, this is it. And so if we're not allowing our hearts to be molded and softened by God, they can become calloused. And what Jesus is saying is the light that's in us can become darkness. And it can. My question is, how tender do we want our heart to be? Really? I mean, that's what it boils down to. We can't whoop it up. You can't, I want it really badly. You know, it's one of those things of walking with God where I say, God, I'm thinking this now. I really want to be very tender toward you. I don't want the light that's in me to be darkness. I want to see clearly. I want to have your heart toward this world, toward my friends, toward the people I love, toward people I don't know. But I can't make that happen. I cannot make that happen. Hard as I try, there are things where Rip becomes more important to me than any of those things. I can't change that. But God can change it. He can come in. If we invite God in to our lives and we really want to be different people, He'll make that happen. There was this man's house. He had built the house, and then him and his wife had children. They had 3 boys. And one of the little boys, children are like this, right? I remember Jackson went through this phase where he liked to grow stuff. They'd love to plant something and see it grow. I mean, it's exciting. And so this little boy planted a tree next to the house. It was an oak. And the tree grew and grew and grew. And boy, the little boy loved it. It got big enough when he was in his early teens for him to actually climb up in it. You know, it had gotten that tall. And so he would climb in it. And his whole life, this tree was growing. And then the son, like most children do, moved away. And then all of a sudden at 30-something years old, the parents got the phone call that nobody wants to get. Your son's been in an automobile accident and he was dead. So the father, the grief, all of that with parenting, I can't imagine what that's like. But the father had the tree, right? It reminded him of the boy. This tree was there, but there was a problem. They planted it so close to the house, the tree had gotten so big that now the tree was actually, he was in the bedroom next to where the tree was planted, and the wall was cracking because the tree's roots were lifting the house. The tree's got to go. It's the house or the tree. Well, you can imagine this father having to go out there knowing that this is the tree that he and his son planted together, and he's lost his son. But he recognized it's the house or the tree. So he went out and limb by limb, he cut it down. And the whole process, he said, was just incredibly painful. He said, every time a limb hit the ground, it reminded me of the son, my son, that I'd lost. And then finally, the tree came down and the house was saved. That's kind of what God does in us, right? There's stuff in us that we hold to that God is saying, I want you to be free from that. That man was in bondage to that tree. The tree was not his son. He could never bring his son back. If the tree swallowed the whole house, it wouldn't change anything. Your son is gone. But it's the same with us. You know, God gives us chances to be changed. And he's offering it to us, saying, don't let the light that's in you become darkness. Because how dark is that? God does not want preaching and teaching and Bible reading and spending time with him to be something that does nothing but reminds us of our failures. That is not what he wants. It is not. Everything that happens to us with regard to things that God wants to change in us is there to make life better for us. It's there for our good, always. God is a giver. He's not a taker. And he is giving you and me opportunities to let the light that's in us be light. Some people find it easier to remain blind than to see. They do. We're all like that to a degree. There are things that all of us hold on to that are causing the light in us to be darkness. We're holding on to them because we've held on to them for a long time and they're comfortable. And it's hard to think about them not being there. God wants to set us free from that. How good would it be to walk in this world utterly free? And you know what they are and I know what they are, right? We know the things in us that torment us. All of us have them. What would it be like to walk in this world from this day forward, set free from those things that torment us? He gives us that chance. He gives us that chance. Are we going to take it? I don't know where everybody is today, but if I've said anything that you've got a question for me, you want to pray with me, you want to talk with me about your life with the Lord, I'll stay here as long as it takes.